Thank you very much, Grace, and thanks for organizing this talk during my visit to Dublin. And you can see the title. That's what I'm going to talk about. A couple of quick disclosures. I'm a scientific advisor for Yummy Foods and Else Nutrition. Those are both nutrition companies that are making new formulas and infant foods and book royalties. What I want to talk about today is covered on these learning objectives, and I'll talk about patterns of sugar intake in children and a little bit about adults relative to current recommendations. And most of my talk is US centric, so it'll be US recommendations, which talk about different types and structures of dietary sugars, which is probably familiar for most of you. But just to make sure I cover the bases and how they're metabolized and how they're different, because it's the metabolism of some sugars that are most problematic and most disruptive, not necessarily the calories. And in particular, we'll talk about how this is particularly problematic to infants and children during growth and development, why they are in fact vulnerable to those adverse effects. We'll talk about not just obesity, but other chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, as well as learning and cognitive outcomes. And to end with, in the middle, we'll talk about zero sugar non-calorie sweeteners, because every day there's more information appearing about those, and I could give a whole talk on low-calorie sweeteners, but I'll give you a quick overview and talk about the different structures and how those also can affect the body. And so recently, as I was giving this talk, it occurred to me that when I was talking about sugars, I really was talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly, because there are good sugars that I do want to talk about. The natural sugars in foods, such as in whole fruits and in dairy, and particularly, of course, for infants and children, lactose is a critical sugar, the predominant carbohydrate in breast milk. But also in breast milk, there are complex sugars called human milk oligosaccharides. And I want to talk a little bit about those too, because we're doing quite a bit of research on those sugars and how those are important for the growing body. And then there's the sugars added to food during processing, bad. And then it really has occurred to me that low-calorie sweeteners are the ugly, because these compounds are designed to be calorie-free, are hundreds to thousands, if not tens of thousands times sweeter than ordinary sugar, and are a great marketing tool because they're marketed as zero sugar or zero calories. And we're just beginning to learn how these compounds are really affecting the human body. Okay, just as a quick background, here is some ecological data on not necessarily sugar consumption, but sugar production. The WHO has marvelous food records on all things consumed, including sugar, going back to 1900. Here's the data. In tablespoons of sugar per person per day, based on US production data. And as you can see, there's a rapid increase, flattening, and then a decrease in actual sugar consumption. That's good news. The bad news is we're consuming other sugars beyond sucrose or table sugar, like high fructose corn syrup, which was developed as an alternative sweetener made from corn in the 1970s, and now constitutes almost just as much sugar consumption as regular sugar, and quote-unquote other sugars. As I mentioned, over 200 names for sugar now exist. And you can see now the level of consumption is about 30 to 35 teaspoons, this is for adults, of total sugar. This does include all sugars, so this would include sugars in fruits and dairy, for example, but it's mostly added sugars. And the recommendation for added sugars in adults is about 10 teaspoons per day. So we are, 3 to 3.5 times higher than those recommendations. And for infants and children, I'll just show you some key data. So in the US, 70% of all processed foods in the grocery store contain some type of added sugar. That number is 80% if you just count foods and snacks that are specifically marketed towards children. 60% of infants and 98% of toddlers consume added sugar, and almost 40% of all products in the US targeted towards infants and children list sugar as the primary ingredient. That's the bad news. The good news is that it has been recognized that consumption in infancy is a problem, and in fact the most recent dietary guidelines for America from 2 years ago for the first time recommended 0 added sugars for infants between 0 and 2 years of age. That recommendation, though, does not obviously align with some of the food environment that mothers and infants are exposed to. Here, for example, is the recommendations for added sugar in intake for infants and children from 0 up to 18 years of age, relative to the added sugar in some popular grocery store items. So I'm listing here 2 different recommendations. The one on this side and on your right is the most quoted recommendation from the American Heart Association, which recommends 0 added sugars up to 2 years of age, and then a fixed amount from 2 to 18 years of age of 24 grams of added sugar, which is about 6 teaspoons. But it occurred to me, though, that a 2-year-old is not the same as an 18-year-old. So I calculated over here what the added sugar intake would be to be equivalent to 5% of energy intake, which is the WHO recommendation for added sugars. And you can see it increases from 2 years up to 18 years of age. Now, I don't say to parents that parents ought to memorize this and go about counting every gram and every teaspoon of sugar. But when I do talk to parents, I say, keep in mind what the recommendations are and weigh those up against food labels at the grocery store and make informed decisions. So you can see here some of those informed decisions might be quite well compromised by these recommendations, because you can easily exceed the recommendations with some of these popular food choices. Juice intake is another big concern. In the US, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends no juice before 12 months of age, and increasing amounts from toddlers through children. However, there's a bit of an ambiguity, because the FDA and the USDA do not recognize the sugars in juice as added sugars. Some others, like the WHO, would call those free sugars, and I like that definition, because the sugars in juice are free of their whole source. And I'll show you in a minute why this matters, why the liberation of sugars from fruit becomes particularly problematical. But unfortunately, as of now, the USDA does not count the sugars in juice as added sugars. I'll talk a little bit about how sugars affect the growing body, and I won't be able to talk about all of these different organ systems that is affected by sugar, but I will talk about some of them. And in addition to that, of course, we've also learned over the last few years that poor diet, particularly a diet high in sugars, worsens susceptibility to viral infections and increases severity of infections as well. So dietary sugar and added sugars particularly affect multiple parts of the body. But I'll talk a little bit about why this is particularly problematic for infants and children. And the issue is not just that we're consuming more sugar or that our kids are consuming more sugar. That's definitely an issue. But I'll talk about 3 factors that I think are conspiring to create this perfect storm for sugar problems. So we have this high sugar environment. Kids today are consuming more sugar, but it might not be more sugar. It might just be different types of sugar. all those 200 different names, the high fructose corn syrup sugars, the fruit sugars, and more liquid sugar. Juice replacing water and milk as a source of hydration, for example, is not just more sugar, but it's more liquid sugar, and I'll get into that in a minute about why that's problematic. The second factor, as if that wasn't a problem by itself, is that infants and children are driven to consume sweetness. Babies are in fact born with this innate preference for sweetness. It's meant to be an evolutionary survival thing that would promote the liking of breast milk, which was sweet, and to favor the seeking out of good calories and to avoid food that had perhaps spoiled. But this innate preference for sweetness is backfiring in today's high sugar food environment. So, driven to consume in a high sugar food environment. And then the third factor is physiological vulnerability. Once consumed, there are various aspects of growth and development that make babies and kids more vulnerable to the adverse effects of excess sugar. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One very clear-cut example is tooth decay. And the reason that children are more vulnerable to tooth decay is because as teeth are erupting, they don't yet have the enamel to protect the tooth from the acid that's produced by the bacteria feeding off the sugar that gets stuck on the mouth. So that's one issue. Another issue I'll talk about in a moment is brain development. As the brain is developing, it can be permanently affected by sugar, and I'll show you some examples of that. Hard to show in human studies, but I'll show you some animal studies. So these three factors conspire to create this environment for a slow and gradual development of chronic diseases and issues related to health, learning, and well-being. This I'm sure you all know, but just as background, the main sugars I'm going to talk about, the monosaccharides on your right, glucose, fructose, and galactose, and the disaccharides on the right. Those are the predominant sugars, sucrose, lactose, and maltose. But as I mentioned, there's over 200 different names, which I can't fit on one slide, but here's a good number of those different names that are used by food companies to represent sugar. And some of my favorites are organic brown rice syrup. So this is an example of a sugar that is marketed as a healthy-sounding compound. So I think any consumer would probably know that corn syrup, for example, might be detrimental to health, or high fructose corn syrup. But organic brown rice syrup sounds okay because it's organic, it's brown, and it's rice, but really it's just a glucose syrup made from rice that's organic and brown as opposed to corn that's yellow. But at the end of the day, it's the same compound, the same chemical.